you guys. Today we are going to continue my conversation with my dear friend Stephanie Forbes, a highly sought after speaker and consultant in the SCM, supply chain management space. If you recall the last time we chatted, our discussion revolved around areas of vulnerability and fraud and what to do to prevent them in your organization. Put your seatbelts on because this conversation can potentially save you and your organization millions of dollars. Hopefully, hope you enjoy.
It's also quite complex, right? So as a leader in an organization who's not in the weeds with like how things are entered into the system, or if you're not part of like fraud investigation teams and things like that, it can be difficult to be like, there's a problem there. And some leaders, even when presented with, hey, I think this is going on, are like, I don't understand what the problem is. And so, it really comes down to a lot of education, a lot of understanding, and a lot of continuous learning within your leadership teams to make sure that you understand what this looks like and what this occurs. Because what'll happen, and I'll use this to sort of drive into the next story. What happens is you have a breakdown in certain practices between, say, functional groups, or even between functional and operational groups. And individuals within their silo might not necessarily recognize that there's a problem. But when you take a step back and you look at it from a supply chain lens, you're like, whoa, what's going on here? And often we don't see those until they get to be really big, where you have a breakdown. So the next example I have is there was a third-party audit done of a very large corporation. And what they started looking at was, okay, how many of our payables, including employee data, have the same bank account? So the reason that's important is every organization and most individuals should all have their own bank account. One exception might be husband and wife, they work at the same place, and maybe they have the same bank account. No problem, we can understand that. So this organization goes through and does an analysis of all the bank accounts, and it comes back and it says, wow, there's 75 people that have the same bank account. This is fascinating.
Somebody's got 75 wives?
Maybe, like that's serious. And so as they get into the details and they go and they look at all these individuals, 74 of the 75 no longer work at the organization. However, they're still getting paid. And when they look at who all of these 74 people work for, they work for one person who also has the same bank account, who's still there and happens to have been their manager at the time in which they were there. So this individual failed to let HR or payables or somebody know that these people no longer work there, and was continuing to receive all of their paychecks.
Wow.
So imagine that over 2 years, 3 years. How much money is
75? We're not even talking about one or two. Like seven, that's pretty bold.
Very bold, right? And then, but the thing is you start getting away with it, right? So, after 6 months, and after a year, you've gotten away with it. Another 18 months, you've gotten away with it. 2 years, 3 years, right? So the longer you get away with something as a fraudster, the more emboldened that you become. And that's usually when they get caught. If it was 1 or 2 or 3, some of those, might not necessarily get caught, but usually there's this sort of ramping up that occurs. But yeah, so then so where's the breakdown, right? So is the breakdown with that operational group? Is it with HR? Is it with the audit group? Like who's responsible for making sure that these breakdowns don't occur? And then how did payable or HR get everyone's banking information to be the same for all of these people?
That's the thing, right? Like that's a huge red flag. Like if I were the manager, I would have opened bank accounts at like 10 different banks at least.
That would have been the smarter way to go, right? It's just open a whole bunch of different bank accounts for each one and then consolidate them on the back end. And then be like, I don't know why HR didn't take them off the payroll. But so it's just really interesting, right? Because you get into some of these and you're like, okay, so like, but there's tons of it out there. And it's a lot of times not necessarily individuals that you would think would be doing the deceptive practices. Because you look at them, you're like, dude, you're a manager, you're a director, you're a C-suite. Like, why do you feel the need to do that? And I have no right answers. I have no idea why people do the things they do. I don't know if it's like to see if they can, to flex power. Like I actually don't have an answer to why they do the things they do for some of the ones that I've seen. But I do know that it's out there and it exists. And if you have a large organization and you do a lot of payables and you have multiple people figuring out where your invoices are coming from and who's getting paid doing what, you have fraud. Like, if you look at the average multi-million to multi-billion dollar organization. It's anywhere from, 20,000 to 100, 200,000 invoices a year. There is no way you have one person who's got a handle on that. Right?
No, 100%.
Like, you just don't, right? So, and you've got like stuff for, $25. You got stuff for $2 million, and you got everything in between. And so, we think we're going to like leverage all these tools. We're going to put in, RPA. We're going to have robotic process automation. We're going to have a three-way match in the system. And that's great. And I love RPA, but you still need to do fraud checks, because if I'm really smart and I know that there's an RPA tool doing a three-way match, I make sure it matches. That doesn't mean the work's been done. That doesn't, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff. And especially if I have somebody on the inside who's approving my invoices, all I have to do is make it match in the system, and RPA will do it itself. So I really feel that we're in this sort of next level of sort of scrutinization, right? I think we're in the next level of, what fraud looks like, what security needs to look like around our data. And once an organization loses control of their data, the ability to commit far more sophisticated types of fraud just sort of increases. It doesn't mean that we can't have those other types of fraud, like bribery and bid rigging and product substitution or price fixing. Like, all those things can still go on. But if I can manipulate the data and I can change where those wires are being sent to, it's faster, easier, quicker, and it's quite hard to figure out, because the average wire or EFT, right, we expect it to take 2, 3, sometimes 5 days. Well, if I've received it 5 days ago and I am a sophisticated thief, that money has long been withdrawn. It's spread apart 100%. Across the world. It's gone. It's gone.
So here's my next question. Now, we all know that putting in systems and processes in place is an absolute must. With the dawn of AI, we can better automate our processes and support our systems and support these checks and balances, so that, humans are humans, right? And they'll, like, no matter what the point that we just discussed earlier, even if you run a report, if the person is not trained to ask the right questions on that report, you're still going to be like that fail-safe is not there, right? Whereas 100%. If you train the AI to look for particular things, then I feel like that might be less things will fall through the cracks.
Yeah. So Really great point, Kat. Really great point. So duplicate or unusual invoices, AI for sure can pick that up. Boom, done. Duplicate bank information, AI for sure. Boom. They can grab that. They can even pick up things like unusual subcontracting, where something doesn't fit a certain thing. AI can flag those things. Some stuff that I think is a little bit harder, that requires human intervention, is unusually low bids that are well below a certain threshold for a certain scope of work. Sometimes late bids are a problem, but with the use of tools like Ariba out of SAP and a bunch of the other software tools for your RFX processes, oftentimes late bids are actually, you can't even see them. They just get sequestered into a late bid folder. So it depends on how you have your things set, or you can't even submit them. If the time has passed, your button no longer works. So depending on how your system is set up, it doesn't even actually occur anymore, almost late bids. If you're still working on a manual or an emailed process, sometimes late bids could come in. The problem with late bids is that means that everyone else's bid is in. If you have an inside person, they can then tell you what the other bids are. Then your late bid can undercut them by just that you get the work. So that's why there's a problem with late bids, but it's not as, with the new technology these days, I'm not seeing late bids as the same problem as it was, say, 10 years, 15 years ago. The other thing that AI, I think, is getting better at is shell companies. However, I still think that's a really big issue. So shell companies are a problem because if I'm an employee and I set up 30 numbered companies. So 1, 2, 3, 4 Alberta Limited companies. And I set them up, and it's for, fencing supplies, rock hauling, grading, right? And so they're really mom and pop shop style services, which a lot of organizations have, especially, if you're working in a remote area, you're going to have a lot of mom and pop, sometimes numbered companies, sometimes proprietorships, like just really small companies.
Right.
But you'll see what'll happen is an employee will go and they'll create a whole bunch, they'll maybe create 15 or 20, and then they'll issue out small dollar POs, $300, $500, $1,000 that all live within a threshold. And then certain thresholds are auto approving through the system, or that person can approve them through the system. Keeping in mind that the average leader right now, if you probably looked into their approval inbox, it's probably 20 to 100 a day of approvals. And what they do is they hit select all and then they go approve.
No.
And
what's the point?
I know. So that's a huge problem. And especially if they're low dollar, if it's $200, $100, right? As leaders, we're like, I can't get into all those details. I'm going to look at the one for 2 million. That's the one I'm going to go look at and scrutinize.
For sure.
But if I have 20 between $200 and $1,000 invoices a month that I'm cycling through my little shell companies, I can do fairly well. And by the time it gets found out, like, how do you, like, it's quite complicated to go and find them. You would need a police investigation. You'd need to figure out who opened those bank accounts. It becomes really, really challenging to find out. So I'm hoping with some of the advent of some of the new AI tools that shell companies will be easier to be found within organizations, because they either don't match up to a scope of work, or there's no tracking sheets within the organization to substantiate the work or the goods received.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's one other one that I'm going to quickly touch on.
Yes,
and
please.
that's when you have systems and governances in place. So I was at an organization, we had fantastic systems and governances, and we had one specific report that we looked at, which is a goods receipt versus an invoice receipt, which means that once I've issued a PO and my goods come in, I get a goods receipt flag, and then I need an invoice that matches up with that goods. And I need that invoice to occur within 30 days, or it flags in the system to say, hey, like something's not happening here. And it gets moved over, because we need to make sure that we process our payables in a timely manner. Well, you had an individual in the IT space who knows that as soon as that happens, there's a flag that's created. So when the goods came in, they did a reversal of the goods receipt in the system and closed the PO. They still had the goods, but what they had done is they had created a whole series of off-book credits with a vendor that they would buy goods on and cycle them through. But as soon as the goods hit, they would reverse the goods receipt and close the PO, and then manage the money on an off-book credit account. And
okay,
so
hold on. I don't necessarily follow that. So the reversal PO, can you explain that? So that you are the person who does the receipt. You've ordered, boxes of whatever.
I've ordered an Apple Watch. Apple Watch for myself. And my Apple Watch comes in. Great. So instead of the goods receipt being completed that says the goods arrived, the goods receipt, because I have my super access in my system, I go and I reverse it. I unclick it, I reverse it. Once it's reversed. Reversing means that you're effectively saying, I don't need this anymore. I did not receive
I'm going to cancel the PO. Oh, I did not receive it. Okay.
This was selected in error. I did not receive it. I am deselecting it. I'm saying the goods did not get received. And now I'm going to go and cancel the PO.
Okay. So then what happens next? You can't. So that's the reversal. You still have the Apple Watch.
I still have the Apple Watch. And so then what happens is that PO falls off of any report because it's been closed.
Right.
And so the vendor then has a whole bunch of credits that aren't loaded in my system. They're just in the vendor system. And all they do is deduct the Apple Watch from the credits that they technically owe my organization, but I'm just ordering them for myself for things. Oh,
very sneaky.
Very
sneaky.
Yeah. So something like that, you can move through, $250,000, $500,000 a year, and then it's just goods, right? So it's, in this particular case, it was computer goods. So like an Apple Watch or an iPad or a computer or different things like that. Right. And so when we set up our governance tools, like a report that specifically looks at goods receipt, invoices receipt, and we have a whole governance model around it because that's really important. Here's all the things we need to catch and measure. When you have somebody who knows what that governance report looks like, then they move pieces around the outside of that governance report so it doesn't get flagged and triggered. So even when you develop great governance practices and protocols, you still need to revisit them regularly and figure out ways that individuals could move outside of the reporting and the flagging tools that you have. And that is, is really what's happening more and more, is that people are figuring out how can they maneuver outside of the way that we've developed our governance criteria and our audit criteria. I still think it's critical to bring in third-party organizations to do audits on a regular basis. And you need to do those audits. You have to do those audits because you never know who within your organization may be up to something deceptive. And I'm not saying like everyone's a crook. It's like a handful of people at best. But what happens often is people can be blinded to it. Like, oh, Kathy's worked for me for 25 years. She's the best. Like, she would never do anything wrong. Well, meanwhile, Kathy's siphoning, hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Like, those are very real, like, things that occur. Like, no one's name here is true, of course, but like, you need to really watch, because there's certain individuals that are empowered within an organization that have a lot of access, have a lot of pull, know how to do things, are trusted upon. And to bring in a third-party auditor, it makes no one within the organization a bad guy or gal. And two, it allows the opportunity for a nice objective view of all of your data sets and taking a look at, your current best practices, if you need to augment, or what some other governance protocols might look like.
But not only that, so number 3 is that your leadership team or whoever is, and everybody in the organization, for one thing, doesn't have the skill set to look for. They don't have a know-how inherently to look for, unless you train them. But then they're only limited to what you've trained them on, right? So they don't have the know-how to detect something that has gone awry. And secondly, they're so busy doing their own work that they're not necessarily, they need to make their own work streamlined and efficient. They're not necessarily going to be looking for, how can, $500 escape the company without us knowing, right?
Well, and often too, they're like, well, it's a couple $100. Like, what do I care?
Exactly.
Well, that's the stuff that you found, right? That's the stuff that you found. It's like dust bunnies, right? If you see one, there's probably a couple more under there. So I just really think that it's really important to understand that it's a problem and we don't necessarily have a lot of visibility into it. And if you don't mind, I just share some stats with you. So there was a PwC study done, and they had done some interviews. And in those interviews, they came up with some facts. And basically what they said is that of the reported organizations, only 55 said that they have concern. And a very slight minority use any tools to identify and combat it. So you have 55% saying, hey, I'm pretty sure I have a concern. It's fairly widespread concern. But a very, very few percent said, I've got tools. I can identify and combat it.
Wait, are these private companies or public companies?
That is a great question. I don't know. I will get you the footnote you can include it in your podcast. I don't know the mix of the organizations interviewed by PwC.
I wonder if they are. I wonder if they would be private, because public, you're subject to a lot more scrutiny, right? But that said, these are operational things and not necessarily like disclosing, to your investor relations. So,
well, it's different. I have a concern is one thing. I have a known bona fide problem of fraud is another. So in terms of your due diligence as a senior leader or a director of a publicly traded company, there's one thing about having a concern that I need my operations group to go take a look at. It's another thing I know we have fraud because it came in through the whistleblower line. That's a known problem, concern we need to go and investigate. Having a concern, hey, do we think fraud could be occurring? It might be, okay, go take a look at that. Those are two different thresholds.
Right.
And so having a concern is a different threshold than knowing you have a problem.
That's right.
That's the only real differentiator I would provide there.
Yeah.
So the next one is 42% of organizations do not, this is a negative statement, have a third-party risk management system, or do not do any risk scoring as part of their risk management system. That is terrifying.
That is
It's
insane.
terrifying.
So first of all, what is a risk management system?
So risk management system, so it can be as simple as an Excel sheet where you go through and you list the things that are a risk, and then you have likelihood and impact, and you go and you heat map them and say, okay, I think the likelihood of this is really high, the impact is really low. The impact,
Okay.
right? And so you could even use something as simple as an Excel sheet or a sophisticated tool that blends in with your ERP. Like there's lots of different tools, risk management tools out there. But just think of it as a system that helps you determine the likelihood and the impact, and then how important it is. So whether it's urgent and important that you deal with it and rectify it, or if it's something to put on your to-do list for your KPIs next year. So that's
Gotcha.
basically how that gets mapped.
So it's identifying where your holes are in your boat and then how bad those holes are.
Yeah, or that you might have a hole.
Or you might have a hole. That's right.
Yeah. So it's a lot of it has to do with like the probability, right? So what's the probability that this is going to occur? And
That's
so
pretty
I would
subjective,
say,
is it not? Like, unless you have like an actual tool that is based on stats or like a history or
right.
whatever.
Yeah, so there are tools that will help you load probabilities and say, based on your industry, based on your size, here's what the probability of what we think would happen here because of this industry knowledge. And so those are systems, right? So that's a risk specialist with a sophisticated software system could come in and help you do that with an actual system that pulls a lot of those data. Those are expensive, fancy, wonderful systems. Major organizations would do something like that, but just for like the average person, if they're like, well, how would I do this? Well, you could do something as simple as an Excel sheet heat map, or you can get a big system that helps load probabilities for you. You can do a bunch of different things there.
And at least you have the awareness that, you might have, like, these are all the vulnerabilities in your organization. You said 42%?
42% don't have any third-party risk management system and don't do any risk scoring. And so risk scoring, it to me is like that Excel sheet. That's like a risk scoring exercise. And a third-party risk management system, there's tons of different tools out there that can be used for that, but you'd load up your stuff and it would pull some data for you. So the next one is that 59% of companies completed an enterprise-wide fraud assessment in the last year, and a further 12% plan to complete one within a year. So we are seeing an uptick in people going, we need to do an assessment. So, we have a concern. Now we're going to do an assessment. So you can see there's a lot of correlation there between people identifying that they have a concern and now trying to come up with ways to do an assessment to figure out where the holes are, if I have any, and if I have some, what do I need to do about them?
Right.
Interestingly, 72% of boards of directors are updated regularly on efforts to investigation allegations or mitigate the fraud risk. So that to me means that 72% of boards, if they're updated on efforts to investigate allegations, you have a disconnect between, you have a whole bunch of stuff going on and you guys aren't doing enough about it. You've got almost 20% there, a little more than 20% there we have a problem and we're doing these investigations, but we don't actually have a system or a tool.
So hold on. So I can understand that stat. So 72% of boards are say that they're okay. So 72% are actually informed.
Efforts to investigate allegations.
Gotcha. And 20% are absolutely not informed of these vulnerabilities.
Yeah, 20% of companies do not use data analytics in any way to identify procurement fraud.
And so here's the thing, if your organization is big enough to have a board of directors, like there's serious revenue going through that organization. And to have like even 20%, it's kind of a lot of companies that surprisingly don't actually keep their board of directors informed about all of these things that could be going on.
Well, it is, right? So if you're the 20% of companies that do not use data analytics in any way to identify procurement fraud, right? And then your 42% don't have a third-party management system, right? Yet 72% of your boards are investigating allegations. Like
how are you doing it?
How are you doing it?
Yeah.
So you've got a big gap there, right? In terms of you've got a problem, but you don't have your systems and tools. You don't have a plan. Like there's just a really big sort of compounding effect there of gaps. And
that's interesting. I didn't even think to link those items together because that's like saying, yeah, we understand. but we're not going to do anything about it.
Or we don't have the resources, or we can't quantify it. So because we can't quantify it, we're not going to attach resources to it, right? And so it becomes a bit of a chicken and the egg, right? When it talks about like resource planning, right? So it's, you're doing your annual reviews of, who needs what. And we're like, hey, we really need an internal audit team to go and investigate this. They're like, well, how much do we really think is there? Like $500? Like, I'm not going to hire 2 FTEs to look for $500 in fraud. Like, it's not worth our time, and I'm not putting that resources in it. And that's when, okay, sure, let's bring in a third party company that works on a commission basis. They'll take 3 to 5% of whatever they find. And it's interesting when you bring in these third party audit firms, you're like, 3 to 5% for anything you find. And they're like, yep. I'm like, you're confident you're going to find stuff? They're like, yep.
That's hilarious. So the 3 to 5%, I read this in the article and I was wondering how you came to, or how they get paid really, right? So if I were an auditor, okay, my fee is 5% for easy math, and I am charged to identify vulnerabilities in your organization. So I find out that, so it's the cost of the financial impact on which I would be remunerated. So that's what my 5% is based on.
So can I give
you
you an
guys are
example?
losing $20,000 a month. I get 5% of that. Is that what that means?
Yeah. So say I had 30 contracts, and I said, hey, audit firm, I need you to come in. These are my highest spend contracts. They're for goods and services. And they're like, no problem. And I said, please go take a look at all of these. I look for everything. And so they go through and they look for appropriate invoicing, appropriate rates, fraud, all the things. And they go through and they go, okay, well, of these 40 contracts, we found $15 million in payment overages, wrong rates, duplicate invoices. I'm not sure what these ones are, but we're going to put them into a mystery pile over here that we need to take a look at. And so that of that $15 million, they would get their 3 to 5%.
5%. Oh, gotcha. So it is we found questionable stuff amounting to X number of dollars.
Yeah. And then if you go, so then they pull this bucket of money and it looks like 250,000, and they're like, oh man, this is actual fraud. This is like, ooh, ticky-tacky-toe. We got a big problem here. Okay, we need to go and deep dive that. And then you would bring them on a retainer basis, say, $30,000 to $50,000, and say, go and do a full proper, all the way deep dive audit into what this is and figure out what's happening here. And so then they would come back and go, okay, well, you had these duplicate invoices being processed under a different bank information, under a numbered company, under like whatever. And that's where that's happening. These are the people that signed off on everything. You go talk to them, you realize that there's collusion, and, someone's getting maybe a kickback in there or some other type of thing, or a fishing trip. And you figure it out that way. There's a lot of fishing trips.
What?
It's kind of,
seriously?
Yeah. So it's a really big thing where they'll once they get an award, when they go from the RFP stage to the contract stage, after the contract's been awarded, there'd be like, oh, all the guys get to go out to a fly in, fly out facility for like these crazy, 3-day, 5-day fishing vacations. And fishing trips. Yeah, it is. Or they'll get a Sea-Doo or a snowmobile or an ATV. Like there's like, it's just, it's really interesting. The one I saw was a group of senior individuals really wanted to go see the Masters. And so they were flown down to Augusta, Georgia, and put up in a house and everything else like that, to go meet people and go watch golf during an active RFP. You're not supposed to do that.
During an active RFP. I wonder who put them up.
Somebody who could afford that type of activity.
Well, they could, because they're getting the work, aren't they?
They are now. Those types of things you really need to look at, right? And it's hey, we all want to go and do trips and do team buildings and things like that, but we got to be really careful when we do it and how we do it. And showing up at something like the Masters, we call them boondoggles, on a boondoggle to go, do that when there's an active RFP, or when it's not the appropriate, time to do those types of things. You got to really be careful.
So that's interesting though, because like, who's going to call them on it? They're senior leadership. Yep.
And that's no one, right?
Right.
And that's part of, how do you how do you ensure that your organization is maintaining the appropriate standards and rigor and everything else if your senior leaders are behaving in that kind of a manner?
Unethical.
It really helps open the doors to other individuals in the organization to go, I'm just going to go do this over here because I can.
Well, these guys are doing it. So.
Yeah. Or they can be, so sometimes too, you'll have a senior leader direct, somebody to go do something that turns out to be fraudulent. And that happens actually quite a bit. That's where you get a lot of input in the whistleblower line. If people know that they're being told to do something that's inappropriate or unethical or fraudulent, and that's when you'll get a lot of feedback to the whistleblower line, because like, how do you complain about your senior leader who's using something that's not appropriate?
So interestingly enough, this whistleblower line, now I've never been, or maybe I have been a part of organizations, I just never knew because I was a consultant on the outside. But what does this whistleblower line look like? Like, is it anonymous? Do you submit an email, a form?
Great question.
And who manages it?
So it's a third party contract. So
I would third party. Okay.
I'd hire like Whistleblowers Are Us. I'm just making up names here. more fake names. But I'd hire like a Whistleblowers Are Us company, and that company is going to charge me a monthly fee plus XY dollars if there's any investigations. And that third party organization will receive phone calls, will receive emails, will receive a number of different ways and platforms for somebody to submit something. So that then that third party group receives the information, reviews the information, and then comes back, and they're direct line back into the board of directors. They usually don't deal with anyone in the C-suite. It's usually direct back to the board of directors, or sometimes internal audit. Whoever is responsible for internal audit goes right to them. Because say, for example, you are complaining about your CEO doing a whole bunch of fraudulent and unethical things, and it goes back to the CEO to say, this is what you're doing. That's probably,
people have lost their lives for this.
Yes. And so it's really hard when you start complaining, like how that all works. And so generally speaking, in very general terms, the Whistleblowers Are Us line comes into an internal audit person and or the board of directors, leaving out the operational groups. And basically they go through, they take all the information, they investigate, and then they can also determine in some instances whether or not they need to inform like police, depending on what's occurring and how that contract is set up.
That's crazy. That's very insightful. Thank you for clarifying that for me. Like, you always hear of, whistleblower, but then you never really think about the facility behind the scenes, to like the system that enables somebody to, call it on their organization.
Yeah. And you have to keep in mind too that, sometimes the whistleblower line, they get all sorts of stuff. They get disgruntled employees, so people who've just been, say, let go, they'd phone the whistleblower line and levy a whole bunch of complaints and stuff like that. Right. And some of them are just people being really frustrated. They're angry and they're looking to reach out and sort of feel heard. So that does occur on a number of instances. Oftentimes, though, individuals are still quite skeptical that the whistleblower line is confidential or that it won't get back to them. And depending on your role within an organization, if you're only like one of three people who would know something, the likelihood of them figuring out it's one of three people is really high. So that's also what the whistleblower line helps with, is when you get a hold of the third party line to say, hey, like I'm like the only one in the organization that actually probably knows this information or has access to this information. So it's really important that, my like how this is communicated needs to be done in a certain way that my identity is not immediately revealed, or if that's going to happen, that there's some sort of precautions taken to help protect that individual.
Right. I mean, bad stuff does happen. I mean, look at Boeing, what happened with Boeing not too long ago, right? And I'm sure others in history, I can think of. You can Wikipedia. All you need to do is Wikipedia it, and then you'll see a whole bunch of really interesting stories there.
Yeah, there's a ton. Like, there's absolutely a ton. And so, it's also part of the problem is that, if you see something going on that is fraudulent or wrong, it's really hard sometimes to have the courage to say, hey, this isn't correct, because there might be more at stake than just, getting fired, right? Like you do have to pay attention to who you're working for. And there are some organizations that, are a little bit more aggressive in terms of how they manage their internal information or any any type of acts like that.
That's so hilarious. Aggressive. Air quotes. So I feel like this might springboard into another topic, but I do remember us talking about vulnerability in your data. And in one particular, now this just happened I want to say it happened last year. Do you remember that really large organization that had a data breach, and it brought that organization to its knees? So it's not necessarily like fraud or anything, but it still came out
data
of
manipulation.
Data, exactly. So I'm wondering whether or not we can talk about that in our next get together.
Absolutely, we can talk about that in our next get together, because there's a whole bunch of other data breaches that are occurring in 2024, and I think we can talk about all of those collectively.
Oh my gosh!
In terms of what's happening in the world, why this crazy data, it's sort of cyber breach year. That's 2024.
And what is that? Really?
Yeah. So we're on record for some of the largest, craziest cyber breaches in current history. And so there's like pretty major stuff happening in the cyberspace, and might say, well, what does this have to do with procurement? Well, as soon as I have access to payment, the mechanism for getting it out of the organization is normally through the supply chain process and accounts payable, which generally work together. So you need an invoice. So you need a PO in the system, you need an invoice, and then it needs to get routed and paid. So that's the procure to pay cycle in a nutshell. And once you're in that cycle, that's how you move money. Right. Or it's an employee salary. But, there's very limited ways to move money out of a large organization. Right. There's payroll, and there's your procurement processes or your procure to pay cycle. There's not a whole lot others. Right. Sure. There's the odd, occasional check that's being written for, I don't know, whatever you write checks for these days. But most everything is EFT or wire. And so even the employee payroll is all through electronic funds transfer. So we can get into that next time, but like as soon as you have access to the data and you can manipulate the data, you're going to move money.
Yeah, 100%. That's really what it's all about. At the end of the day, like all of these cyber things sure, it's like an act of aggression, perhaps, right? But ultimately it all has to do with the money going out of the organization. Yeah,
I'm going to tie some things together for you next time. We're going to talk about the Azure environment. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, Azure. Okay. Thank you so much for your time and all of your insights. You're a wealth of knowledge in this regard. This has been such an illuminating discussion, as all of our discussions are usually very illuminating. And I really enjoy our chats, every single one of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Kat. Always a pleasure.